Gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't heard about. Today is my turn, and what I'm doing today is actually part 2 of what I was doing last time, which is the philosophy of JRR Tolkien. And last time I talked about his religion and how it influenced and inspired his writing and some of the ideas that he had. Of course, it's not the only source of inspiration that he had, but what I want to do today is talk about his philosophy in general and his methodology. And so I'm going to go through it, and then Stilgar, you can ask all the questions, like whatever you had pending from last week too, if you want. So why do this? Well, if anybody's been listening to our channel for a while, you know that I like to get close to the cultural side of things and really understand it. And also, Tolkien, he was a guy that delved into history and mythology a lot, kind of like we do here. And we live in a time when there's some interesting trends, to put it politely, going on with the entertainment. And, Tolkien, he's trending. There's a certain big corporation that's trying to do their own kind of show and put his name on it. Of course, I'm talking about Rings of Power. So there's a lot of chatter about this. And what I want to do is let JRR Tolkien speak for himself, because he is one of my, I would say, one of my role models, like to some extent a mentor, even though he's dead. So just as a disclaimer, though, I will say that we're going to talk about his philosophy. Whenever we do one of these videos about somebody's philosophy, it doesn't mean that we're trying to push it or agree with everything that they say. It's his views that we're discussing and anybody else's views. Of course, in the case of Tolkien, I do agree with a lot of what he has to say, but at any rate, that's enough preamble. So let's go ahead, and the first thing I want to talk about is his hatred of allegory. Because you may have seen Stilgar, but there's a lot of people, like even especially here on YouTube, and maybe not so much on BitChute and Rumble, but people that are saying, oh, we found out what his work really means, and it's a symbol for this or it's a symbol for that. And none of that is true at all. So the first thing I want to do is quote from the intro to Lord of the Rings, actually. And what he said there is, and this is, to one of his many attempts to lay to rest people speculating about what his work, really meant, what it's really about. So, as for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. And he also says, I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestation, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed domination of the author. So again, a good story you can make all sorts of analogies based upon it, but when it's an allegory, the meaning and purpose of it is kind of locked into place. It's pretty much defined. He said, I've heard people say that it's inspired by World War II. His work is inspired by World War II, but in fact, he started working on it way before then. He started working on his stuff before World War I kicked off, actually, though, of course, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings came later. What I would say is if his work really had been inspired by World War II, then the good guys would have actually just kept the Ring of Power and used it, for their own purposes. But As it happens, there's more. He had a lot more to say on it. So here's another quote. This comes from letter 203. He says, "There is no symbolism or conscious allegory in my story. Allegory of the sort 5 wizards equals 5 senses is wholly foreign to my way of thinking. There were 5 wizards, and that is just a unique part of history. To ask if the orcs are communists is to me as sensible as asking if communists are orcs. That there is no allegory does not, of course, say there is no applicability." And in letter 215, he says, "I have no didactic purpose and no allegorical intent. I do not like allegory, properly so called. Most readers appear to confuse it with significance or applicability." Regarding Lord of the Rings, and this comes from letter 181, he says, "There is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all." Letter 165, he says, "Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political." There's more quotes. I could keep going on and on with this, but hopefully that should be enough to get the point across. I would just encourage people that if you're really interested in the work of JRR Tolkien and you want to understand him and you want to understand, the guy that wrote and how he thought, read his letters. Just read it rather than try to put your spin on it. Okay, and here I'll read one more. This comes from letter 131. He says, "But an equally basic passion of mine ab initio was for myth, not allegory, and for fairy story, and above all for heroic legend on the brink of fairy tale and history, of which there is far too little in the world, accessible to me for my appetite." And if anybody's interested, there's in letter 229, he strongly repudiates the introduction to the Swedish publication of Lord of the Rings. The introduction was written by a guy named Ake Olmarks, and he made all sorts of assertions about hidden meanings in Lord of the Rings, and talking about what Tolkien quote really meant, trying to put all kinds of spin on the book, and Tolkien was enraged by that. So again, that's if anybody wants to read the details about that. It's letter 229 from a letter to Allen and Unwin, which was the publisher, that originally had published his work. And this was written in 1961. So again, like all the people that are saying it's got hidden meaning and it's an allegory for this or an allegory for that, if JRR Tolkien were alive today, he would be very offended with you for doing that. So, I'd say if you respect him, don't do that. And I also, one thing I've noticed about a lot of people today, especially with the online discussions, is that a lot of people confuse inspired by with represents. So, you can be inspired by something and maybe that will show up in your story or it'll cause you to write a story, but that doesn't mean represents. So like in the last video, we talked about how J.R.R. Tolkien, his image of what was the perfect female, the perfect beauty was the Roman Catholic depictions of the Virgin Mary. And so he modeled Varda, one of the Valar, off of that physical appearance. And that doesn't mean that Varda is Mary. The physical appearance and the connection to stars was inspired by that imagery, but that's not the same as is. So hopefully that's clear enough. Now that I've kind of gone over what he did not do and never would do, I want to talk about some of his methodology. And I've been researching him for years. So some of his sources of inspiration, which I have found, just to summarize, they include languages, nature, ancient ruins, medieval architecture, Germanic mythology, Finnish mythology, Celtic mythology, particularly Irish, and of course his religious worldview. And he does tell us what his original purpose was for setting out to create his mythology. And this comes from letter 131. He said, "I was from my early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in other lands. There was Greek and Celtic and Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, and Finnish, which greatly affected me, but nothing English, save impoverished chapbook stuff. Of course, there was and is all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain, but not with English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. So Stilgar, why does the Arthurian legend not count as English? Do you know?
I have no idea.
Are you familiar with King Arthur and all that stuff? I mean, you must be to some extent, right?
To some degree, but it's not nearly as big here as it is over in the US and the UK.
Right. Well, because if Arthur and his people, his allies, actually existed, I mean, there probably was something there, but basically, they were not English. You know, they were the people that were there before, and they were actually fighting to stop the Anglo-Saxons from taking over the land. So basically, what happened is the English people that came, or rather their ancestors, and invaded England, or at the time called Great Britain, or just the Roman province of Britannia. They invaded it, and King Arthur and his people were the ones that were trying to stop them. So they conquered these people and then turned them into folk heroes and legends. So it's kind of interesting about, you know, like the victor kind of idolizing and boosting up the loser. So assuming they existed at all. But basically that's, you know, the actual English legends, they came originally from Denmark. So they were part of that same group of people that believed in like the world tree and Odin and Thor and all that kind of stuff. So part of his methodology was, of course, drawing from his own culture, the area of the world he lived in, and his history. And here he gives some instructions if you want to write as he does. He says, in any case, if you want to write a tale of this sort, you must consult your roots. And a man of the northwest of the old world will set his heart and the action of his tale in an imaginary world of that air and that situation, with the shoreless sea of his innumerable ancestors to the west, and the endless lands out of which enemies mostly come to the east. Though, in addition, his heart may remember, even if he has been cut off from all oral tradition, the rumor all along the coasts of the men out of the sea. So, as I've mentioned, I think in the video where I talked about the life of JRR Tolkien, he used to have this dream, like recurring over and over again, of a huge wave coming over the land, like a green kind of forested, fertile area, and just destroying or submerging everything. And one of his sons inherited this dream, which I don't know how that happens because he didn't really talk about it with them. But, you know, I guess, you know, there's some people that theorize that genetic memory is a thing. I don't know if that's true or not, but that had to do with the building of his Numenor legend. Like he worked it into the story where Numenor gets submerged. This thing about men, you know, the rumor all along the coasts of the men out of the sea. You live along the coast, Stilgar. So do you have any idea about that? Like who's coming along the coasts in the ancient mythology?
Who's coming along the coast in the ancient mythology?
Yeah, do you have anything in the local mythology that you might know what he's talking?
No, well, we had Vikings coming along the coast here, ravaging
Right.
and pillaging the place. Well, other than that, I have no idea. No.
Yeah, and of course, I also know about the Vikings. And Tolkien, he didn't really. The Vikings, as that when they appear in his lore, they don't appear as good guys. They are one of the reasons why elves actually flee to Tol-Eressëa in the earlier versions of his lore, which you can read about in the Book of Lost Tales. But you know, in my study of mythology, the only thing I know of is some of the Irish legends where the Tuatha De Danann, they come and they settle in Ireland and they're immortals. But some other group was there first. I think they were called the Firbolgs. And the Tuatha De Danann, they come out of the west. And they settle there. And then later on, within that set of mythology, the Irish come and they supplant or rather, they overwhelm the Tuatha De Danann and force them to move underground, basically. So that's the only thing I know of about men coming out of the sea. Of course, Tolkien, he knew more than we did, but maybe that would be something for us to investigate to find out, like what are some of these other rumors, what he's talking about. I think King's Sheep is another one, about this guy that comes over the sea and he becomes the king of the ancient early Germanic population, I suppose in Denmark, the area of Denmark. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. So basically, he really loved his history and his part of the world, including the physical landscape. And that is what inspired at least the look and feel of his world. Now, another really huge source of inspiration to him was language. Of course, we talked about that in the other video where he was a polyglot, and he used to enjoy studying other languages, and he would get into like the sounds of the language. Like the way languages sounded to him would elicit an emotional response. Like, I like this, I dislike this, that kind of thing. So I have another quote here. He said he believed that language was essential to mythology. So here, this comes from letter 180. He says, "It was just as the 1914 war burst on me that I made the discovery that legends depend on the language to which they belong, but a living language depends equally on the legends which it conveys by tradition. For example, the Greek mythology depends far more on the marvelous aesthetic of its language, and so its nomenclature of persons and places, and less on its content than people realize. Though, of course, it depends on both, and vice versa. Volapük, Esperanto, Ido, Novial, and C are dead, far deader than ancient unused languages, because their authors never invented any Esperanto legends." So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting take, like Esperanto I've heard of, these other languages I have not, but basically he says that language and mythology they're tied together. And
that's why Klingon is very much alive as a language, because of all the rich mythology. Sorry.
There actually is some Klingon mythology.
Yeah.
We could probably do a topic on that, but I wouldn't do that for this channel. People will leave. So maybe for my personal channel. I mean, there are some people that do actually speak Klingon. I think there's probably more people that speak Klingon than Esperanto. Like, who cares about Esperanto?
Well, and because I think there's some truth there, because I'm joking about it, but because when you speak Klingon to somebody else that speaks Klingon, they have something in common to talk about, which is the rich lore of the Star Trek, what do you call it, franchise?
Yeah,
universe. Or the universe, yeah. So you could be talking about different customs, or you could role play around it. But Esperanto is just, I guess, it's just technical. It's like more like a machine learning. There's no soul behind it, like a machine learning language, or like how you would program a computer.
Right.
Like, you wouldn't speak to each other in binary code either. I mean, I'm sure some people could, but yeah. So anyway, yeah. So I guess it does make sense that you need to have lore and identity, I guess, for a language to survive, which is, I guess, also why a reason that Tolkien is important, but also people like for the English language, like Shakespeare, plays a pivotal role, right? All those stories that bind the language together. So
yeah.
I
mean, there's lots of there is some good English literature. I think One of the things I read in high school, one of the few things that I actually liked was Milton, and the Fairy Queen was pretty good. But yeah, I mean, it is important to have culture, and there's no culture behind these invented languages like Esperanto, and I guess these other ones I've never heard about before. But yeah, so Tolkien, of course, he invented his languages, but then he put an origin, while he was building the languages, he was also building the culture. So the language was informing the culture, and the culture was informing the language. And if you get into the histories of the Middle Earth, where a bunch of his essays and exposition is compiled, some of it he gets like really into the weeds, like talking about why they use this word and this sound, and when this sound developed, and so on and so forth. So it's
Yeah,
not
but
for everybody.
didn't he study languages? Like that's his background, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What's it called? Philology, or isn't that what it's called? Or
Yeah, he used to teach classes on languages too. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, he is a philologist. Um, I believe that and C.S. Lewis, one of his best friends, and I don't. You haven't read the sci-fi trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote, have you?
no, only the first book.
All right. Well, okay.
Yeah,
You read the first book, you
yeah.
said.
Hmm.
So I believe that the character of Ransom was actually inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, because he was a philologist, right? And he also had views on theology and stuff. He's a conservative Christian guy, um, even though he drinks, of course. But the only thing is, C.S. Lewis was the guy that used to like to go on these big long walks, not so much Tolkien. But yeah, I believe that the main character in that was kind of inspired by Tolkien, his best friend at the time. So the next thing is his style of writing, and I think this bit here is one of the things that really makes him different from the majority of authors, and especially from the majority of people who want to be authors but have failed to achieve any success. So what he says is that his style of writing is discovery rather than invention. So he's not putting the pen to the page with like a big outline in mind or anything like that. Basically, he has an idea and he starts writing and he sees where it goes. So I do have some quotes about this in case anybody wants to try and follow his methodology. He says, yeah, the mere stories were the thing. They arose in my mind as given things, and as they came separately, so too the links grew, and absorbing the continually interrupted labor, especially since, even from the necessities of life, the mind would wing to the other pole and spin itself on the linguistics. Yet always I had the sense of recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. So basically, the ideas are coming to him, and it kind of comes to him as he writes. He's not like forcing himself to come up with anything. Or at least that's the way I understood this. So when he's writing Lord of the Rings, he started off with the premise of the ring being a problem. The ring, of course, was introduced in The Hobbit, and at that time, he hadn't really decided what it was exactly or how important it was to the narrative, the overall narrative. So this premise, of course, was followed by the Dark Lord and a quest to solve the problem. Um, and he mentions, and this is in his letters, he mentions that Aragorn was not part of the original plan. But Aragorn is, of course, immensely important to the story. The return of the king is Aragorn is the king. He's taking his throne back. But he wasn't in the original plan. Um, so, in fact, what he said is, so the essential quest started at once, but I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I already knew, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at the inn was a shock, and I had no more idea who he was than had Frodo. And that comes from letter 163. And of course, letter 163, he goes into a lot of details about this and his methodology, but yeah, basically he didn't start out with like an outline, like, well, I'm going to put this in my story, and this is the sequence of events. He'd sit down and he'd start writing, and the stuff would just come to him as he goes. So that's unthinkable, I think, for the majority of people that try to sit down and write. Like, and usually, like when I'm reading something, I can tell when it's really forced, and when the author has no ideas or if he's drawing a blank. You know, and a lot of authors, they waste time on filler, like irrelevant things, because they couldn't come up with you know, they couldn't come up with something to do, I guess, so they're just trying to fill the pages. But yeah, I don't believe Tolkien, he suffered from writer's block. Like I hear a lot of people say, I got writer's block. Like, well, how do you have writer's block if you got a story to tell? It means you don't have a story to tell if you can't think of anything. So he also mentions the rhyme of lore, 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree, and said he learned what it meant when he saw the Palantir stone thrown out of the window. So he had wrote this poem earlier, you know, about the 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree. But it wasn't about the Palantir until, you know, he came to the part where he wrote about them throwing it out the window. He said rhymes often cropped up before the meanings and the context of them did. So he'd sit down to start writing a lot of these poems, and you can read a lot of his poems in, I think it's like the Tolkien Reader, or maybe the Perilous Realms. They've edited these things together in different ways. Perilous Realms is a good one to look at if you're interested in some of his other works and methodology. So yeah, kind of different from what most authors do, and probably most people cannot do that. But also, it's important to remember how much he read himself, both of history and mythology, and also attempting to read, you know, the works of other authors, which a lot of times he just didn't like. But and you know, and like I mentioned in the last video, of course, he's part of the Inklings group. So for more on his methodology and his view on fairy stories, and you know what all that means, you know, like in the United States, when people say fairy, when you hear the word fairy, what comes to mind is something that's nothing at all like you know, Tolkien's ideas. So when I was a kid, it's usually like people would think of something like Tinkerbell, you know, small with insect wings kind of flying around. And of course now, you know, maybe we think of something even worse than that, if you get what I mean. But his ideas were quite different. And there's actually an essay that he wrote called On Fairy Stories, which you can read about. It's included in Tales from the Perilous Realm, along with some of his other stories, like Farmer Giles of Ham, Roverandom, Adventures of Tom Bombadil. That stuff is there. Smith of Wotton Major. So I'll just read a few excerpts from fairy stories so that you can get the feel of it and his methodology. Because, you know, it seems to me like when it comes to his idea of fairy stories, he saw it as dipping into a realm of inspiration, which, if it wasn't a real place, it functioned as a real place. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But let's see here. The realm, here it is. I'll just read a few excerpts here. The realm of fairy stories is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. Okay, stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, are relatively rare, and as a rule not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches, Naturally so, for if elves are true and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this also is certainly true. Elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor we with them. Our fates are sundered, and our paths seldom meet. Even upon the borders of fairy, we encounter them only at some chance crossing of the ways. So this thing about our fates are sundered and we're estranged talks about, that's what happens during the fourth age of Middle Earth. It's kind of one of the things that's brought about after the destruction of the ring, is that humans and elves grew apart. And of course, it's mentioned in Silmarillion that our fates are sundered. Like humans, they go to heaven or hell when they die, and they go beyond the confines of the world. Whereas elves, they kind of respawn. Like in a video game, you die and you come back. Although not that quickly, obviously. They're reborn in their children. But the main thing here that I get from this is that he saw this as whether or not he really believed there was a realm of fairy. He saw it as something that at least existed as a concept, which could be dipped into, and not as something that's like an allegory or a device to be used to depict something else, or to make a moral point or something like that. So again, like people all the time are talking about like, oh, I figured out the true meaning. This means that, and this means that, and this is really this, and this is really that. And like, no, it's not. So I would encourage everybody to just read what he actually said, because it's quite interesting, especially if you're interested in writing yourself and you want to try to duplicate his methodology. Again, like not everybody can, but I've been able to duplicate like the whole thing about the story just coming to me, where I can sit down and write something and don't know where it's going to start and where all it's going to go. I mean, I know where it starts, but I don't know where all it's going to go. So that I can do. The whole polyglot invented language thing, that's not going to happen, but then, somebody else will be able to get into the languages a lot, and then somebody smarter than me, of course. Any questions about the methodology, or we can move on?
No, I like the idea of that he didn't know what Strider was going to do when he walked, when they walked into the prancing pony.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like it's so different from the way that most people try to write their stories, because Aragorn is a huge part of the story, and without him, it'd be something completely unrecognizable. But he didn't sit down. It's like most people, they would come up with their idea first, and then they'd write it. So he starts writing and comes up with the idea. So when he sat down to start Lord of the Rings, he had no intention of Aragorn. Like Aragorn was not there. He was not part of the original plan. There was no original plan. It's just like, this is where I left off with Hobbit, and this is, I'm gonna pick it up and start going. So,
that's probably also why he didn't write that much, or he didn't finish that much anyway.
Well, we talked
besides
about
the lack of time, but
the lack of time, but also he spent a lot of times, like he gets stuck on details. Like, why do the elves use this word? Why does this group of elves say it this way and this other say it that way? It would really, and you can read the histories of the Middle Earth if you really want to get into the weeds and get all the details. It's kind of like Leaf by Niggle, which I think you haven't read yet, but Niggle never finished painting the tree. He set out to paint a leaf, and then because he painted that leaf, he had to put it on branch, and then he had to paint the whole tree. But what he really enjoyed the most was focusing on that leaf and making the most splendid leaf that he could. So it's kind of like that. And again, he didn't write allegory, but there's some applicability there. Niggle is not Tolkien. Okay, let's be clear. But it's a similar kind of struggle where there's a small vision and there's a grand vision. And I'm sure if he had somebody like sitting on his head, forcing him and pushing him, he would have completed more stuff. But without that pressure, like when he stopped being friends with C.S. Lewis, it wasn't really like that so much. So he would get off on tangents about smaller items, and and then he'd also like come back and start doing revisions. So he would.
Yeah, but I would say that's innate to his writing process.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
just how he worked. Like, you have some of these prolific writers out there that write, they write like several books a year. But I'm pretty sure they don't sit down and are like, okay, somebody walks into a bar. I wonder what's going to happen next. I don't, besides the whole detail, I get the leaf part, where they get hung up on like details of the language and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that that's part of the way he wrote. But anyway, I don't know. I feel like somehow those two are connected as well. But yeah.
Yeah, and there is one thing that I didn't mention. He did at one point start writing an actual sequel to Return of the King set after the death of Aragorn in Gondor. I haven't read it yet, but he started writing it, and then he decided, as I was writing it, I discovered that there's nothing worth covering during this time period. That's not his exact words, but I can put the quote in there in the slideshow. When I go through this, I'll put the relevant quote. I'll have to find it again. But basically decided that this is not worthwhile, which is kind of unfortunate because I would have liked more details about like how we get from his world to the so-called modern world. Like what's the connection? So and there is like some more connection. Like the earlier versions of his lore was more connected. Like it was designed to lead up to at least as late as the Viking invasion of England, which was originally what propels Alfline to go overseas to try and get away. Like in the original Alfline story, the Vikings are coming, they're ransacking England, and a lot of the elves that were remaining in Middle Earth had kind of concentrated in England. And after the Vikings started doing all their damage, these guys got in boats and started sailing off to Toleracia because they just couldn't take it anymore. They're like, enough of this human barbarism. And so Elfwine, he wanted to go with them. And they wouldn't take him, of course, because he's a human, but then he decided to go for it on his own, basically. And again, that's like in the Lost Tales, I think the second book of Lost Tales, if anyone wants to get in that. But let me get back on track. So I want to talk about his politics. And again, people like to make everything political today. His works were not at all political. He was not, as I said, before, and he said he was not writing to comment on current year wars or politics, or to write stories about them, or to disguise them in an allegory, nothing like that. But his political views are kind of interesting. He doesn't talk about them that much, but I did find some things. So it may or may not surprise you to find out that he disliked democracy. And he said, I am not a Democrat only because humility and equality are spiritual principles corrupted by the attempt to mechanize and formalize them, with the result that we get not universal smallness and humility, but universal greatness and pride, till some orc gets hold of a ring of power, and then we get and are getting slavery. So it sounds like, he's concerned about demagoguery, and that comes from letter 186. And then he also says, and this is from letter 52, my political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs, or to unconstitutional monarchy. And I'll put more on this in the slideshow here if anyone wants to read the complete quote on that. But basically, he wasn't fond of a lot of the political systems. And so it's important to remember, like, he witnessed the communist takeover of Russia, as well as the communist takeover of China, Mao's Cultural Revolution, all this kind of stuff. As for communism, he had some things to say about that, which were rather scathing and which I agree with fully. So one thing is, during World War II, he was concerned that the daily worker was being distributed in the streets, and nobody was like trying to shame those people or tell them to bugger off or stop or go away. And by the way, the Daily Worker was the newspaper that was put out by the British Communist Party, like the official, actual Communist Party that existed during the time. So there's a quote here. This comes from letter 42. It is also plain that our dear old friends, the USSR, are up to some mischief. It is a pretty close race with time. I don't suppose mere citizens really have any knowledge of what is going on, but plain reasoning seems to show that Hitler must attack this country direct and very heavily soon and before the summer. Meanwhile, the daily worker is cried in the streets unmolested. We shall have some lively times after the war, even if we win it as far as Germany is concerned. So he saw this as a bad sign that things are going in the wrong direction. And it turned out to be the case. He'd be abjectly horrified if he saw the current state of things right now, the way it is over there in England.
Yeah, but it also shows that he knew that there would be a fight with communism after, and it also implies that the whole Hitler movement didn't come out of nowhere either. So,
yeah, he
yeah,
had some thoughts on Hitler as well, which I'll come to. Yeah, he knew that. Of course, he admired the German culture. And, he had some German ancestry himself, although he didn't identify with it. He identified with England, completely. But well, I'll come to that, and I'll come to that momentarily. Another thing he said here, and this comes from letter 52, but the special horror of the present world is that the whole damn thing is in one bag. There is nowhere to fly to. Even the unlucky little Samoyeds, I suspect, have tinned food, and the village loudspeaker telling Stalin's bedtime stories about democracy and the wicked fascists who eat babies and steal sledge dogs. There is only one bright spot, and that is the growing habit of disgruntled men of dynamiting factories and power stations. I hope that, encouraged now as patriotism, may remain a habit. But it won't do any good if it's not universal. So imagine somebody saying something like that today. And I also think that, if JRR Tolkien was alive today and he tried to publish the exact same stories that he did publish for the first time, nobody would pick him up. Because one reason is because everything has gotten too political, and, there's like DEI and all kinds of other nonsense going on, and I mean, they would reject his work. They'd call it like some kind of supremacist, of R word, all this kind of stuff. And then they might say, we've taken enough stories from people of your demographic. We need some others. So it would be very tough for him to try and publish his stuff today. It's fortunate for us that he lived in the time that he did, because today he would just not, like, we would never know about him, right? I mean, he might try to use the internet to get some of his stuff out, but the thing about the internet is there's so many people that are trying right now. And then one last thing I'll say about communism is that he was sad and distressed about how Finland was getting ground down by the Soviet Union, because of course the Finnish mythology and language was a big source of inspiration for him. It's what got him started on inventing his Elvish languages. And now I want to talk about Adolf Hitler and his thoughts on that, because it was also quite prescient. And that comes from, let's see here, letter 45, and I've bookmarked it here. Page 55 if you have my version. So People in this land seem not even yet to realize that in the Germans we have enemies whose virtues, and they are virtues of obedience and patriotism, are greater than ours in the mass, whose brave men are just as brave as ours, whose industry is about 10 times greater, and who are, under the curse of God, now led by a man inspired by a mad whirlwind, devil, a typhoon, a passion that makes the poor old Kaiser look like an old woman knitting. I have spent most of my life since I was your age studying Germanic matters in the general sense that includes England and Scandinavia. There is a great deal more force and truth than ignorant people imagine in the Germanic ideal. I was much attracted by it as an undergraduate, when Hitler was, I suppose, dabbling in paint and had not heard of it. In reaction against the classics, you have to understand the good in things to detect the real evil. But no one ever calls on me to broadcast or do a postscript. Yet I suppose I know better than most what is the truth about this Nordic nonsense. Anyway, I have in this war a burning private grudge, which would probably make me a better soldier at 49 than I was at 22, against that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler. For the odd thing about demonic inspiration and impetus is that it in no way enhances the purely intellectual stature. It chiefly affects the mere will, running, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed the noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. Nowhere, incidentally, was it nobler than in England, nor more early sanctified and Christianized. So, one of the things that really upset him about Adolf Hitler is he thought that the way that Hitler was like promoting the ancient Germanic culture, or like, at least LARPing or pretending, acting as though he's promoting it and saying he's fighting on behalf of these older values and our ancient ancestors and all this kind of stuff. Ends up making that stuff odious, which we can see today if you write something that's really. So, for example, one of the problems with Rings of Power is that they can't even cast the right racial demographics in order to accurately depict his stories. Why can't they? Well, because of the politics. So since World War II, he is right. They totally stigmatized Germanic history and to some extent the themes. Like when Disney, Marvel, they did their depictions of Asgard. They couldn't even get like the demographics right. Like they put a black guy for Heimdall. Well, the Vikings and all the ancient Germanic cultures had never seen a black person before. There's no way they would have ever conceived about of Heimdall as looking like that. But it comes back to, like, as a result of what he's saying, you can't be pro-Germanic or present this culture and history accurately, and especially not in a good light, because there's all sorts of political noise out there. And even to a greater extent, like, all Europeans are kind of saddled with the burden of, World War II, what Hitler did. And a lot of people forget that it was other Europeans that stopped Hitler. Like, the rest of us, we blanket bombed that country in order to stop him. And it was mostly Europeans that got killed in order to stop him. So his prediction is right. I mean, it's like totally been stigmatized. And again, it comes back to, if he was alive today trying to publish for the first time, he would not be picked up. They'd say, you can't have, what do you mean, like, all the main characters are white? You can't have that. Oh, what do you mean? It's like, it's the ancient world, or it's like the ancient world before the ancient world. He's basically reverse engineering an older time before the official history begins. So things like demographics and such, it has to be based on the area. But can't do that anymore because it's considered politically incorrect. So, but that's one thing I've noticed is, man, like all because of Hitler, so many things that got ruined, especially as far as regular people are concerned who don't know any better. But of course, European history is full of us killing each other. We've been doing it as far back as history goes. We kill each other more than we fight with different races, actually. Although maybe that'll change in the future. We'll have to see. So, any thoughts? Or all right, we'll go.
No, I mean that's pretty obvious.
That's pretty obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess he foresaw what would happen after the war. That the National Socialism would tarnish all of this European great cultural legacy, because the National Socialists would pick from some of these stories and use it as this for their ideology. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he, of course, and the thing is, like, studying history, the more you study history, understanding the past makes you able to understand the future, and you can see where things are going. So that's why, again, I tell everybody, study history, because really, one lifetime is not enough to understand the world, and that's why you should read books. Even if you live to be 100 years old, which most people don't, you still don't understand everything. You have to look beyond the scope of your existence in your lifetime, and then you'll start seeing the patterns and how things work and why, for better or worse.
Well, that's what it is, right? Patterns. Like, you recognize certain patterns because you read about what has happened previously, and based on that you can anticipate what's going to happen next. Like, it's a very important skill to have, especially when it comes to things like, like, oh, we have a certain crisis going on, we should give more power to the government. Is that a smart thing to do? Yes or no? And then if you can go back into history and you see what has been done in the past and how power has been abused, etc., then you'll be able to make smarter decisions. But yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. We'll go on. So, regarding World War II, he had some thoughts on that. And what he said is, I'll just paraphrase it, and then I'll put most of these quotes in the slideshow. So, he said that there were good and bad people on both sides, both on the Axis and on the Allied side. But there's more bad people on the Axis side than there are on the Allied side. And he saw World War II as destroying the commonwealth of Europe and the world, which I agree with. He said the destruction of Germany, and this is a quote, is one of the most appalling world catastrophes. He referred to World War II as a war of machines. And for that, he might, although it's not stated, he may have also been including World War I in that. And he predicted that the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, or rather, he said that the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, which, man, we definitely see that today, right? With everything getting digitized, the people that write the programs and run the programs are becoming much more important than everybody else. Even now we have like AI that's doing the artwork now for a lot of people. So skills are being lost. But again, it's a testament to his ability to predict the future. So yeah, he did call it the War of the Machines. He said, well, the first War of the Machines seems to be drawing to its final, inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant, the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful. What's their next move? So there we go. He also had some thoughts on America, which is interesting. He said, I do find this Americo-cosmopolitanism very terrifying. The bigger things get, the smaller and duller or flatter the globe gets, it is getting to be all one blasted little provincial suburb. When they have introduced American sanitation, morale pep, feminism, and mass production throughout the Near East, Middle East, Far East, USSR, the Pampas, El Gran Chaco, the Danubian Basin, Equatorial Africa, hither, further, and inner Mumboland, Gondwanaland, Lhasa, and the villages of the darkest Berkshire, how happy shall we be? At any rate, it ought to cut down travel. There will be nowhere to go, so people will, I opine, go all the faster. So, yeah.
Wow, it's almost prophetic.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
Although he's wrong about one thing. You know what it is?
What's that?
People aren't just staying where they are. They're definitely coming here.
Yeah,
Like
but
much
they're also
faster.
always on the move,
Yeah.
faster. But yeah, it is. But he definitely was like, there's a Starbucks everywhere. You can buy the same shitty coffee anywhere in the world.
Yep.
So
Overpriced for a high price too.
yeah, it's amazing that he already knew that back
And
then.
you
Yeah,
can get the leftist politics everywhere you go.
because back then, I mean, Starbucks has only been here for like the last 10 years, maybe in the Netherlands. So
I
yeah,
think Starbucks actually came out when we were teenagers. 'Cause I remember, like, it wasn't around back in the 80s when I was a kid, or I never saw one. And then all of a sudden, it's like, hey, this is a cool coffee spot, and you can go to it when you're at Barnes and Noble. You can get books and coffee at the same time. And
yeah.
I never cared that much for their coffee. I can make
No,
my
I mean
own
it's
coffee.
just fine. It's just like it's it's like here. I guess we've had McDonald's for forever,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's just that's everything is the same, just everywhere. It's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, and that bothered him as well. And he saw that those trends were increasing. And I'd say today it's still going on. I don't know if it's increasing or not, because one thing I've kind of seen is a lot of people are getting tired of stuff and starting to check out of the greater zeitgeist that they're trying to force on us all. But he was concerned. Another thing is, like, in general, Tolkien did not like big empires, even though Lord of the Rings ends with the establishment of a big, huge empire. The reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor. Um, he said he was a patriot for England, and he really cared about England, but he was not as fond of the British Empire. He also didn't like the Roman Empire, and
What?
he said, yeah.
Heresy?
Yes, yeah. I'm a fan of the Roman Empire, but I mean, like, my cultural background is a bit different than his.
Well, I
America
guess
is.
if you're into like the Germanic cultures and all that, then the Romans aren't your thing, probably.
He
That's
didn't
why.
like. Yeah, well, in general, he didn't like the idea of cultures being erased. And
Mm.
one thing the Romans did is they took over places that were, I wouldn't say racially diverse, although they did encompass other races as well. But there were a lot of different tribes and cultures in Europe which just got completely Romanized and no longer existed afterwards. So think about all the parts of Europe that speak Romance languages. Originally, it was a bunch of different tribes, right? And they all got assimilated. Like we talked about other things like uh, the the different Celtic tribes, and also the Radic tribe, the Lusitani, right? That Portuguese people a lot of times think that they're descended from those people, but those people just completely ceased to exist as a distinct culture. So we can't even track them down genetically at this point, or at least not that as far as I've seen, it hasn't been done yet. But that kind of stuff. And regarding the Romans, he said if he had been alive back then, he would have been a patriot for Rome, but not cared for the empire. Like, it would have been better if for those other groups, the Gauls and such, to remain free. And of course, he's not going to be, if you take that same logic, he's not going to be fond of America, which was starting to exert all sorts of cultural and geopolitical power all over the world. He also didn't like the American accent. He said it sounded like English after being wiped over with a dirty sponge. That comes from letter 58. Yeah, he didn't like the way we talk. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care. I don't think the British people sound that great either, so whatever. Yeah, but
Yeah, it's a matter of opinion, right?
yeah, it really
Can't
doesn't matter that much. Yeah.
my wife, she hates the Australian accent. She thinks it's the worst form of the English language. Um, and I don't like the New York accent that gets on my nerves. So now there's something else even more scathing that he said about America, which I'll read this and then I'll go on. That'll be the end of this one here. So he said, and this comes from letter 328, and it's in regards to how people were reacting to his books here in the United States. And as I mentioned before, the hippies here in the 70s, they were all like, smoke this and that kind of like, yeah, get back to nature. And their idea of getting back to nature is like lying in the grass and smoking some weed or something foolish like that. But he didn't care for that. So letter 328, written in 1971, he says, I was much interested in your references to M.R. Ridley. We, of course, knew one another well at Oxford. Not until I got your letter did I learn that he had done me the honor of placing the works of his old colleague in the ranks of literature and gaining me intelligent and well-equipped readers. Not a soil in which the fungus growth of cults is likely to arise. The horrors of the American scene I will pass over, though they have given me great distress and labor. They arise in an entirely different mental climate and soil, polluted and impoverished to a degree only paralleled by the lunatic destruction of the physical lands which Americans inhabit. So it's kind of interesting, because he was inspired by the old mythology of the ancient world and, the feel of the ancient world, which I felt that for the first time when I was in my 20s and I flew across the Atlantic to visit Spain. It felt not like visiting another country, but like coming home, because if you think about the grand stretch of it, like, yes, my family's been living in America for about 100 years, maybe 110 years, but for thousands of years, we were living in Europe. So that's where the greater part of the history lies. So, but what he says here is the way that people, and this is just me kind of from reading his other letters and some of the other stuff I've seen, that people here took it as like hippies and green grass, like the hippies, they took it and interpreted it their own way, and they tried to make some weird stuff out of it. Like they totally misunderstood, his intent and purpose and what he was trying to convey. And again, that goes to cultural differences, obviously, between here and England. And talking about like tearing things up here, Tolkien, he also didn't care for cars, and he didn't like that new roads were being built and forests were being torn down. Like that was something that always bothered him. And the way he's talking about uh, the lands being destroyed here in America, might be a reference to the way they were building suburbs like crazy back in the late 20th century. Of course, that had to do with economic mobility, but also the way we use land here was different than the way it was used in Europe because we have so much more land to use. I'm guessing what he's talking about. But we have a lot more nature here, even with all that. And there's forests here that are bigger than a lot of countries in the world. Like you can go in there and get lost and starve to death if you want to. So
Sounds lovely. I'd love to.
yeah. Yeah, and that's another thing is he really did like forests and greenery and hanging out there. And so he never did come to the United States. I'm wondering, of course, I'm sure he wouldn't have liked it if he came, but we do have a lot more nature here than they do in England and probably all of Europe
Might
together.
have. Maybe if you connect it with like the Native Americans and stuff.
He would not connect with them, but
No?
not at all. It's too different. I mean, he wouldn't. He wasn't like somebody that believed in superior and inferior races and such. But man, coming here, walking in a forest here is quite a different experience than Europe. You walk in the forest here, you're gonna probably get. There's a very good chance you can get ticks, you know, and there's like thorns and mosquitoes and all that kind of stuff. Which I didn't notice that when, of course, the only part of Europe I really visited long was Spain. But like one thing I remember when I was over there, the tour guide telling people like, hey, there's no poison ivy. Everything that's here is planted here, you know, because Europe was cleared of almost entirely deforested. And then, you know, it's here, our land is a bit more wild, but
Yeah,
yeah. So I would have been
except
interested to
for
see his reaction.
Russia, I guess.
Yeah, he wasn't that fond of Russia either.
Yeah, I find this whole anyway. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but this whole use of orcs. I was looking on Twitter today or X, and Ukrainians they always refer to the Russians as orcs, which I find interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, which
Tolkien
is
said there were orcs on both sides in the conflict, or rather
okay.
orcish people. And you know, it's interesting because there's a lot of people on YouTube doing videos about what happened to the orcs at the end of Lord of the Rings. What happened, like after the books are over and the kingdom is united? Like, what happened to the orcs? What happened to the elves? What happened to the dwarves? And the take is always they went completely extinct. But that's not the case. Like in The Hobbit, he talks about orcs existing into the later ages and still existing, and that they're responsible for a lot of the cruel machines of mass destruction. So I'm thinking, you know, in his mind, the orcs might be like if he had written his lore up into the modern world, the orcs would probably be responsible for things like the Berlin gun and tanks and the machine gun, which of course just strafed people during World War One. And again, but they would be on both sides of the war and that's what he said in his letters too. But let's keep going. Like I having a hard time. I have a hard time staying. But just a few more things. So some of his other dislikes, he disliked jive and boogie woogie, and that's in letter 96. He said it was music that's corrupted by the machine. I guess he was mainly a classical music and chants guy, you know, which is my thing too. Although I also I like the Orthodox chants better than the Catholic chants if I have to choose, you know, if I have to make a choice. So he disliked the use of airplanes in war, and he compared them with the Nazgul birds, the birds that the Black Riders rode on after their horses were destroyed. And that's in letter 100 if anyone wants to read more. And here he said, I have a quote to his son, Christopher, because, you know, Christopher, he ended up flying the airplanes, and that disturbed him. He says, there is tragedy and despair of all machinery laid bare, unlike and which is content to create a new secondary world in the mind. It attempts to actualize desire and so to create power in this world. And that cannot really be done with any real satisfaction. Labor-saving machinery only creates endless and worse labor. And in addition to this fundamental disability of a creature is added the fall, which makes our devices not only fail for their desire, but turn to new and horrible evil. So we come inevitably from Daedalus and Icarus to the great bomber. It is not an advance in wisdom. And by the way, I also found out more about why he disliked Shakespeare. And he also says that he cordially dislikes Shakespeare, or disliked cordially. I might have to start saying that, like I cordially dislike things that I really deeply dislike. It'll force the you know, normies to have to go look up in the dictionary to understand what I'm talking about. But he disliked Shakespeare because of how he depicted elves, the way that Shakespeare changed the popular perception of them, you know, going from the old kind of Nordic mythology to Shakespeare's ideas. And in letter 151, he said, also, I now deeply regret having used elves. By that, he means the word elves. though this is a word in ancestry and original meaning suitable enough, but the disastrous debasement of this word, in which Shakespeare played an unforgivable Pan, has really overloaded it with regrettable tones, which are too much to overcome. And then he said he disliked Shakespeare as far back as school, I guess middle school or elementary, I'm not really sure. And it had to do with, well, here, I'll just read. I got a quote here. I think to my bitter disappointment and disgust from school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill, I long to devise a setting in which the trees might really march to war. So just basically, since he encountered him, he didn't like him, especially, but mainly the way that he made use of elves. So,
Is that the only thing, or was there anything else? I also don't like Shakespeare, but I never knew why. Feeling on it, my finger on it, but I wonder if you had more reasons other than the misuse of elves.
So I don't know what. I haven't read that much Shakespeare. Mainly, I just like Romeo and Juliet and the Tragedy of Julius Caesar and Hamlet are the only ones of his plays that I'm really kind of familiar with that I've read. So I don't know what this Great Birnam Wood thing was, but so I can't place it in the original context, but it bothered him when he first read it. It seemed like he thought it was a missed opportunity or a lost opportunity, and that the trees, he wanted the trees to really march to war, and he was annoyed with Shakespeare for not doing that. So I think, the personalities are probably so different that he just cannot enjoy what Shakespeare wrote. He also couldn't enjoy the stuff that Charles Williams wrote, the guy that came and joined the Inklings later on and ended up becoming a close friend of C.S. Lewis. Like, the Inklings, they would take turns reading stuff, and everything that Charles Williams read, he just did not like. He was so different. But then Charles Williams liked most of the stuff that Tolkien wrote, so it's kind of a strained, difficult friendship for them. And then difficult when that guy became C.S. Lewis's main friend instead of Tolkien. So sometimes you just don't like stuff, like the style and the content. For me, most things today, I don't like the style or the content. I just completely dislike. It may also be that Shakespeare is heavily associated with England and comes to one of the first things that comes to mind. Maybe not anymore, because these days people don't know anything. But in the past, it's one of the first things that people would associate with England. And that might have gotten on his nerves if he thought that Shakespeare was a poor representative of the country and the culture. And he really did dislike Shakespeare. So.
Yeah, I'm actually listening to Hamlet right now, which is, anyway, I don't want to get too far off, but it is inspired by Anglo-Saxons. So I guess because it's about a Danish, Hamlet is Danish.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, they are like fairly godless, I would say. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah,
and coarse.
That might also be like he didn't like the morality that's on display in Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It could have, some of the content could have offended him too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the last thing I want to talk about is his view on romance, which is interesting and worth looking at because I've never seen anybody that had this view before, and I never thought about it before, but I think he's basically correct. So what Tolkien said is that men are actually the romantic gender more so than women. So the reason for this is that we often see women as like a guiding star type of thing and attach a lot of, maybe not anymore today, but throughout a lot of our history and in Western culture in general, probably especially like in Germanic cultures, this idea that if I can find the right woman, that's going to fix everything. Because I used to think that myself back before I ever had a girlfriend. And then when I had my first girlfriend, I kind of lost that view. But here's a quote, and this is again comes from letter 43. He says, Anyway, women are in general much less romantic and more practical. Don't be misled by the fact that they are more sentimental in words, freer with darling and all that. They do not want a guiding star. They may idolize a plain young man into a hero, but they don't really need any such glamour either to fall in love or to remain in it. If they have any delusion, it is that they can reform men. They will take a rodder, open-eyed, and even when the delusion of reforming him fails, go on loving him. They are, of course, much more realistic about the sexual relation and less perverted by bad contemporary fashions. They do not, as a rule, talk body, not because they are purer than men, they're not, but because they don't find it funny. So he said, women are instinctively monogamous, whereas men are not. Monogamy, though, and this is another quote from the same letter, monogamy, though it has long been fundamental to our inherited ideas, is for us men a piece of revealed ethic according to faith and not to the flesh. Each of us could healthily beget in our 30-odd years of full manhood a few hundred children and enjoy the process. Brigham Young, I believe, was a healthy and happy man. It is a fallen world, and there is no consonance between our bodies, minds, and souls. So he also talks about the idea of a soulmate and how, men especially, they tend to expect this. And what he says is that the real soulmate is the one you are actually married to, even if you're not all that compatible. It just that person is your soulmate because you're married, I guess. And most of the marriages and romances, in fact, accidental. And really, the very few people have like the kind of they find like that ideal person that checks all their boxes, basically. And he also noticed that in cultures where marriages are arranged, they tend to be more successful in the long run, and also happier marriages. So kind of like
Interesting words from this guy that was so keen to get married to this one lady, right?
yeah. Well,
Even
he
though
thought, yeah.
even though they advised against it, and like because he wasn't a Catholic, etc. But like he, as soon as he was old enough, he was like, "All right, I'm gonna marry her." So,
Well,
uh,
the main problem was that she was older than he was. Because there wasn't like really, of course, if you want to have a Catholic wedding, both partners need to be in the Catholic Church, members of the church. But there was no obstacle really to prevent her from joining, other than like social and cultural pressure, some stigmas against joining the Catholic Church, which was a big thing back then in England. But the main objection that like the priest had, his guardian, was that she was older, and he thought that was like creepy and weird, which I mean, it is a little weird. Usually it goes the other way around, but it worked out in the end for him. So
yeah, but he sounds also in many ways he sounds like a romantic,
yes.
and this whole idea of soulmates is something that came out of romanticism. I
Hmm.
don't think that's been around in our culture all the time. I think that is something coming out of the romantic era.
Well,
Uh, when we were also dreaming of going back to nature and talking to trees and whatnot. So um, I don't know. It's just interesting that then at the same time we were so pragmatic, and he said that he would have even said, arranged marriages, and I think I mean, I actually agree with his point. It's just
yeah.
interesting to find that somebody that's so romantically inclined in his writings and his ideas on like, oh, we should be riding horses instead of taking cars. Then at the same time, it's like, yeah, you know what? Like, he had that insight. That's amazes me because I totally agree with him. I think women are more pragmatic. I think they also have to be for biological reasons.
Mm.
Um, and this whole thing about like your soulmate is the person you marry. I mean, I agree, but just interesting to hear it come from him.
Well, yes. So I would say that the whole idea of putting women, I think women, and I think this is what Tolkien was also getting at. in Western culture, they were put on the highest pedestal during the Romantic period.
Yeah, they're your goddess. They're Galadriel. You worship them. We'll
Yeah,
bow down
but
at their feet. Yeah.
what Tolkien said is those tendencies go back at least as far as the medieval period with like courtly romance and chivalry.
Yeah.
So he lays out all his logic in that letter. Um,
Well, that
and
makes sense.
like I also fell into that mentality myself.
Oh, I used to be a believer in that stuff too.
I and when did you stop believing in it?
Oh, I think after my first relationship as well. Yeah.
Yeah, me as well.
I need to start reading about it. You break your heart and stuff, and it's like, oh,
Yeah,
yeah. And plus, like, also with the Christian view, it's like, like you can't just go off and like, um, when things are tough, you have to stick together. I feel like that's something that God calls us to do, right? It's pretty clear in the Bible.
yeah,
And you shouldn't just run after the next person or whatever. Life is not like for some people it is, but for most people life is not like some kind of movie where you're always like passionately in love with each other. I don't know, I think that doesn't work like that for most people, but
right. And he,
yeah.
that's right. And he talks about that in the letter. And the thing about soulmates is, like back then, even back then, there were people that were getting married and then thinking, oh, this is not as good as I thought it was going to be. This person's not my true soulmate. And then trying to cut out of the marriage and find somebody else or maybe cheating on their wife.
Exactly, and then you try to find your fulfillment in the other person. Like the whole idea of a soulmate is not rooted in the Bible, in Christianity.
Right.
Like the person that's supposed to complete you is Jesus.
Mm.
It's not going to be some it's so if you're looking for, if you're trying to fill your Jesus shaped hole with a woman, you're gonna get disappointed. So
Yeah.
doesn't mean that being in love can be, and some people are in love their whole lives and it's extremely fulfilling and happy. um but yeah, even if, yeah, anyway, for a lot of people that's not the case, and that doesn't mean you can just go ahead and move on. It's because you're going to end up burning yourself and chasing after something that probably doesn't exist. And by the way, you shouldn't live that way, because you're supposed to just get married, and when you're married you're supposed to make, you're supposed to love each other. And love is love is not actually true. There's a lot of different kinds of love.
Mm.
And if it's just a romantic kind of love, or like butterflies, or just lust or things like that, there's all kinds of different loves. But yeah, anyway, as a Christian, especially when you have a family, you know anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's gotten much worse since he's passed away, obviously. Like it's gotten much worse. But now one thing I'm noticing is a lot of men are no longer putting the women on the pedestal. Like we have that movement where men are just refusing women. I don't know how big that movement is, but they've got an online presence. Um, but I do still think like it's not as much as when I was a kid. I remember when I was a kid, I'm kind of like right between Gen X and Millennial or Gen Y. And there was a lot of talk like about like, oh, when I find the perfect one, or I'll never stop loving my wife. I'll always be ready to do everything for her, and blah blah blah. Also, some guys, they still tend to see women as innocent, and they if they do something bad, it's not really their fault. And our government kind of operates on this philosophy as well. So he is right in everything that he says. And yeah, he definitely put his wife on a pedestal for a while. I mean, she was the inspiration for Luthien to Nuville, and she actually does kind of look like some of like his wife when she was young. She does look kind of like some of those depictions of the Virgin Mary, some of the paintings. Um, but also after they got married, she wasn't as much into language and mythology as he was, and they had different kind of sleep habits. So they actually slept in separate bedrooms a lot of the times. So the warm fuzzies definitely wore off, but he viewed marriage as a sacrament, and I mean, he did love his wife, but it wasn't like that initial kind of intense idea, I guess. So he's giving his advice to younger people as somebody who's already been through that door, basically. So at any rate, that's one more thing. One last thing is, he also says that he didn't think that men and women could just be friends. So if you're hanging out with a woman as a friend for a long time, then eventually either you or she is going to get the idea of taking it to the next level, even if you're married. So he kind of cautioned against that, and also that, Jordan Peterson, he basically said the same thing. But at any rate, that's all I've got. I know it was a beastly long one, and if anybody is listened to the end of it, congratulations. Now that I've covered this, it's kind of out of my system, so I won't have to come back to it. But I probably will do some more philosophy videos in the future, because it's worth looking at stuff. It's a little bit of a departure from the normal of just history, but the fact is, a lot of these philosophies, they still have a mass effect on culture, and as a result, they have a mass effect on history as well. So that's all I've got. Do you have anything, Stilgar?
Well, I'd say that the reason that I think that Tolkien is so unpopular now is because culture has a huge influence on how we think. And so that's why it's called the culture wars. And they want this idea of right and wrong and good and evil. They want that to be out now and replace it with other stories. So I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about these things because they influence on how you think. It might even influence like on who you marry and things like that. So I agree. It's an important topic to discuss, and anyway, not sure where else to go.
You had some pending questions from the last time that you were putting off, right?
Yeah, except I don't remember them. So yeah, I did, but no, I think it's I think I learned a lot more about the man, and I think I understand also why there's some controversy about him, and I think I understand better why I like his writing. And I agree with a lot of the things he said, including the last point you just mentioned. About not being able to be friends with somebody of the opposite sex. I think is probably really difficult. Especially when you're married. I think it's something to be very careful about.
Yeah, actually, my first 2 romantic relationships that I had just started as friendships.
Yeah.
And then I also learned, that women are not pure and innocent. They're just as bad as we are. It's just expressed differently. And of course, they have a different way of talking and communicating than we do. And that was another one of the things he said in letter 42 is that, when we're young as men, we expect women to kind of help us. But in fact, the word he uses is like they're also shipwrecked. They're fellow survivors of the shipwreck on the same shore with us. So they're not better than we are. We're not better than they are. We're just different. And I agree with most of his philosophy. Agree with I'd say probably 98% of what he has to say. With the other kind of philosophies that I want to go over later, I don't think I can say that for sure. So so I guess we can close it off if there's nothing else. If anybody made it to end, congratulations. You don't win anything, but thank you for sticking with it until the end. And hopefully you enjoyed this. And do leave us some feedback. And let us know. Any requests, concerns, comments. You can say something. And we do read everything most of the time. So there we are. I guess I'll close it off and see you in the next one.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine.